Welcome back to Buddhist PhD Response. I'm Dr. Jared Jones. My research specialty is ancient systems of meditation, Buddhist philosophy, the cognitive science of meditation, and the philosophy of science. This is part of a series where I'm responding to theologians, philosophers, and other interesting things about Buddhism I find on the internet for the benefit of people who have very similar questions and misunderstandings of Buddhism. I'll be responding to Dr. Timothy Tennent in his video, Christianity and the Challenge of Buddhism, which raises a number of issues that people get wrong about Buddhism all the time. Let's get into it.
Buddhism, in many ways, is probably the most challenge for us in the sense that it is the most. We've actually done Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, which is not an historical progression, but it's a progression in terms of the distance from the Christian revelation, right? So we're now at the really distant edges of the farthest way of thinking, and so it will require you to do some engagement, which is what you're noted for here at DTS. So we'll do it. Buddhism traces its origins back to the 6th century BC with a man named Siddhartha Gautama. He was born into a life of wealth and privilege and in a region located today in the border of modern-day Nepal and northeast India. After being shielded from suffering and pain for many years, they claim he went out on a famous chariot ride and encountered the realities of old age, sickness, death, and finally a sannyasa in meditating. And he was so moved by these realities that he himself forsook wealth and privilege of his father's house, exchanged clothes with a beggar, and at 29 years old, he went out into the world in search for the reason and the way to alleviate the cause of human suffering. Over the next 6 years, he studied under many teachers, people who taught him various meditative techniques and taught him various kinds of ascetic practices. He even supposedly at one point lived on just a few grains of rice per day, became very emaciated, and that didn't solve it. Eventually, after meditating under a Bodhi tree
During this period, and I'll probably mention this again, there was a huge flourishing of different religious ideas, philosophical ideas, everything from a fairly modern interpretation of materialism to the idea that nothing existed whatsoever were becoming popular and had adherents during this time. So the Buddha was born and lived during a time of radical philosophical diversity and flourishing. Of course, these debates and so forth were mainly happening in a Vedic context, in the context of people studying and practicing the Vedas. But Hinduism, for example, in the way that we think of it now, did not yet exist. And quite often people think Buddhism is simply a reaction to Hinduism, for example. And yet the Buddha was living at a time where he could have chosen from any number of different views that were popular at the time, and there were dozens to choose from. And we still have records of those in the Buddhist corpus, including the Pali Canon. I'm going to pop it up on the screen here, just one example of materialism being described as nothing before birth, nothing after death. You simply live your life, you pursue pleasure to whatever degree you can, and then that's the end. So the Buddha could have chosen to follow ideas like this. He could have chosen to follow all sorts of ideas, and instead what he said was, I had certain experiences under the Bodhi tree, which he's about to describe in brief, and those experiences are what I'm basing my teachings on.
He had what they believe is to be an enlightenment, after which he receives the title the Buddha, the Enlightened One. Over the next 45 years, the Buddha traveled across that part of the subcontinent.
Another quick note, he's really, really flying over the Enlightenment experience in a way that he shouldn't. I'm going to put it on the screen. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha's enlightenment experience is described in some detail. You find that the Buddha first had an experience of recalling all of his past lives and seeing infinite expansions and contractions of the universe. Second, he reached his mind out and saw all sentient beings in all places, moving up and down according to their karma. And so his idea that karma is what causes sentient beings to move up and down was the second thing that he directly experienced in meditation. He did not pick this up from his Hindu colleagues who didn't exist yet. This is something he directly experienced in meditation. Third, he experienced the destruction of ignorance and craving, and by implication, the destruction of any remaining karma that he had, and therefore achieved full nirvana. sometimes also called full enlightenment, but enlightenment is actually something a little bit different than nirvana. That's a long discussion we can't have right now. Then the Buddha carried on with his teaching career, which we'll get into now.
Briefly, the first two sermons of the Buddha, which have become, in Buddhist thinking, this is like the seminal teachings of Buddhism. The first sermon of the Buddha is known as the Four Noble Truths. And in that sermon, Buddha essentially identified four things that he believed were essential to understanding the nature of the world. The first is all of life is suffering. The word is dukkha. Dukkha is a really important word in Buddhism. It means that life is just shrouded by suffering, and we are captured in this endless cycle of repeating life and birth, of death and rebirth and suffering. It's called the wheel of samsara. In fact, visual aids are always helpful when you're doing Buddhism. This, though it's the Indian flag, that is a picture of the wheel of samsara, because it's something that's shared by Hindus and Buddhism.
In Buddhism, life is not suffering. Consciousness, according to Buddhism, is life. Consciousness is what moves from lifetime to lifetime. If consciousness was itself inherently suffering, you couldn't be released from suffering. Because suffering is occurring on the surface of your awareness, the surface of your experience. They sometimes say suffering is something adventitious to your existence, not innate to your existence. Since that's the case, you can be liberated from it. If it was innate to your circumstances, innate to your consciousness, innate to life, you couldn't remove suffering. So this is a really, really basic and important point that he's getting wrong here. What are these three types of dukkha in Buddhism? The first is obvious or manifest discomfort. There's a bunch of things that you experience that are simply uncomfortable and unwanted. And those are obviously discomfort, obviously dissatisfying. You don't want meaningless pain. You just don't. That's the first type of suffering, the suffering of suffering. The second type of suffering is the suffering of change. The suffering of change mainly refers to things that are pleasurable or comfortable. Why are those considered to be a type of suffering that is revealed through change? Well, take this example. If you have been on your feet all day long standing up at work, it's a relief to sit down. But if you sit in a chair for too long, it's a relief to stand back up. After standing for a while, it's a relief to lay down at the end of the day. If someone forces you to stay in bed because you're recovering from an illness, it's a great relief to be able to get out of the bed. If you eat too much, you become uncomfortable. If you don't eat enough, you become uncomfortable. If you drink too much water, you become uncomfortable. If you don't drink enough water, you become uncomfortable. And so all of the things that we enjoy, we can't actually find a stable condition where we won't grow bored or uncomfortable through the pursuit of those things. Every pleasure and comfort we have, if we continuously engage in it, becomes uncomfortable, dissatisfying. Therefore, since it's ultimately going to become boring and uncomfortable, it can't be relied upon as a stable source of satisfaction. And that's what Buddha's talking about. How do you find a stable source of satisfaction? You can't do it through torturing your body and just creating more manifest discomfort. You can't do it through chasing pleasures because they're unreliable and your experience of pleasure turns into boredom and discomfort and pain. And then what's the third type? The third type is called all-pervasive compounded suffering. And this has to do with not a problem with the world, but a problem with your own mind. Your mind is set up in such a way that it is fully prepared to chase the wrong causes of happiness into discomfort. And when it chases the causes of unhappiness, thinking that they're happiness, then it reinforces the habit to chase things that aren't happiness. And when it does this, it is compounding the problem. It's adding on to the problem. So there's this pervasive problem that your awareness itself is set up in such a way that it will chase, in particular, pleasures and comforts, and it will run away from displeasure and things that are uncomfortable to try to be happy. And through chasing all of those things, it will only find more unhappiness at the end of the process. And through turning the mind inward and addressing the fundamental problem that creates this habit of chasing and running away, this habit can be overcome while you're still alive. So life is not suffering. You just have a mind that's out of control. And if you get it under control, you'll have more peace. If you want some evidence for this, think about the last time you were in a really, really focused, concentrated state. When you're in a state of mind where you can stop, even for a short period of time, this process of chasing after the next thing you think will make you happy, or running away from the last thing that is making you unhappy, in those moments where you can just rest, the mind feels so much better. And so there are formal systems for training the mind to be able to be in a condition that's nice, regardless of what's going on externally. Let's carry on.
The wheel of samsara, I guess for us, can be kind of like the Cubs the last 108 years. And last night was moksha, was nirvana. So, dukkha. Just that, every year, maybe next year. Except in the case of Buddhism, there is no World Series victory.
It doesn't go on forever. If it went on forever, there'd be no purpose in teaching Buddhism. It has no beginning. It's beginningless. It's an infinite causal sequence. But it's something that has a cause, and therefore, if you can interrupt the cyclical set of causes that creates the problem. By the way, the Indian flag has 24 spokes. The causes for samsara are 12. There's only 12. The remaining 12 going the other direction are the unwinding of the karmic cycle. So even in the graphic that he's pointing to, it has both the problem and the solution in one graphic. It's a little bit ironic. So no, it doesn't go on forever. If it went on forever, there would be no point in training in Buddhism. Let's carry on.
It goes on forever. Second noble truth is that the cause of this suffering is rooted in what they call tanha. It means desire. That desire is the source of all of this suffering.
No. Tanha does not mean desire. It means craving. There's another word that means desire, raga. Desire actually here is not the English word for desire, nor is it the English word for craving. So raga means to exaggerate the positive qualities of something and then to chase after that thing as if it could make you happy when it can't. So it's a delusional way of exaggerating the benefits or the positive qualities of something with your perception and then chasing after it. And when you chase after it, inevitably it will fail to make you happy because it can't make you happy. And therefore you experience unhappiness and discomfort and pain. Yes? An example my heart guru used to use is a piece of chocolate. When you look at the chocolate, it almost vibrates. It's almost glowing, when attachment or desire, this word raga, right? When the exaggerated perception is there, and it almost calls to you, right? And maybe it's not chocolate for you. Maybe it's a nice watch, or it's a nice house, or it's a nicer partner, or it's having a bigger amount of money in the bank or whatever. And there are practical reasons to have relatively nicer stuff. But the exaggerated perception makes it seem so much better than it is. And then you taste the chocolate, and after a couple of bites, you're scrolling on your phone, or you're watching a movie, or you're thinking, what would be good to have with this chocolate because it's not quite hitting the spot. So the exaggerated perception very quickly fails to provide the deep satisfaction, the lasting pleasure and satisfaction that you were hoping to get from that. And in particular, it's this sort of thing that drives you to remain stuck in samsara. So in Buddhism, there are 3 types of craving, which is a mental factor that comes after you've exaggerated the positive perceptions of something, where you actually want to go out and get it. You want to acquire it. You want to have it near you. That's the craving, right? You want to acquire that thing or have it near you or to experience it. The first type of craving is for sensual pleasures, as I already described. The second type is called craving for being, which is wanting to be reborn in a condition that's permanent. For example, craving to be reborn in a permanent heaven, which might sound familiar. The third is craving for non-existence. In other words, the craving to go out of existence completely, which is impossible. So even within this first conception of what the problem is for Buddhism, he's getting quite a bit wrong, but these are the same things that everybody gets wrong. There are also positive desires. So for example, If you were to pursue something that actually produces happiness, that desire is not delusional. If you chase after stuff that can't make you happy as if it could, that's delusional and it's going to hurt you. If you chase after something with all of your being that can actually make you happy because you want to be happy, that's not delusional. And the Buddha said, you need to be like a person whose hair or clothing is on fire in your pursuit of liberation. Your desire needs to be completely overwhelming and all-consuming. Now, quick disclaimer, you don't just have that overnight, or you're not like a bad Buddhist if you don't have that next Tuesday or something, okay? But not all desires are bad. So this is a very, very common misunderstanding of Buddhism, that all desire is bad. And this is one of the ways that people attack Buddhism online quite often, is saying, well, if desire is bad and you need desire to get out of the problem, you've defeated all of Buddhism before you've even started. But not all desire is bad. Some desires are good when they aren't aimed at stuff that is a figment of your imagination. Let's carry on.
You have tanha. And then the third noble truth is that the solution is to blow out or extinguish, and this is a word you'd probably know. The word is nibbana. We would say nirvana. Nirvana means to blow out or extinguish the whole source of these desires. And he finally said in the fourth truth that there is a path. It's called the Eightfold Path, which one would go through that would lead you to this place of enlightenment. The second sermon is much more of a sermon that we might call a sermon dealing with the kind of nature of reality. This sermon really explains.
When he says sermon here, he's referring to what Buddhists call the turnings of the wheel. There were 3 turnings of the wheel. The first was the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. The second was the teaching of middle way philosophy. And the third was the Chittamatra, or mind-only school. This is a bit confusing in the way that he's laying it out. When I hear sermon, I think teaching. If we were to make a Buddhist Bible of just the stuff Buddha said, it would need to have 20,000 individual books in it. The agamas are the Chinese versions of these texts. The suttas are the Pali version of these texts. The sutras are the Sanskrit versions of these texts. And the kangur are the Tibetan versions of these texts, translated from mainly Sanskrit.
In the second sermon, he highlights 2 things that are most important. One is the doctrine of dependent arising, pratitya samupada. This doctrine means that everything is caused by something. There is no first cause. There is no first cause in Buddhism, ever. So everything is caused by something else. Again, this is a wheel. This is not a linear history. There's no beginning. There's no end. This is a wheel. Everything.
No, that's not correct. Buddhism is a linear history. When you look at the Buddha's Enlightenment experience, which I put up earlier, he talks about recalling infinite past lives going into the past, not taking the same rebirth over and over and over again. Nietzsche, for example, in my understanding of Nietzsche, has this idea that we're constantly reborn, I suppose, back into the same circumstances to do the same things infinitely over and over again. That's not quite what's being said here. There are a set of causes that cause you to be reborn in a similar way over and over and over again. But if we turn that sideways, even though this causality is going this way, your rebirth is going this way through time. It is a linear process of events through time that are occurring due to the same causes at each instance in time. Does this make sense? So in terms of that causal loop, there's no first cause. Those causes go in a loop that are keeping you stuck in the same type of existence that you've been in from beginningless time. Beginningless time doesn't mean that we have no past. It means that there's no first event. Existence exists as a set of causes and conditions. When you look at the previous moment, it's a set of causes and conditions. When you look at the moment before that, it's a set of causes and conditions. So in a recent video I did comparing Buddhist philosophy with Christian theology, which I'll put a link for up here, I describe all this in a little bit more detail. So Buddhism puts forward an infinite causal sequence of events. And this is not simply Buddhists say there are no first causes. Can you name a cause that is not God, because this is the debate point, and that is not the Big Bang, because we can't look behind the Big Bang and see if there are causes there that are not God. Name any cause in reality that is not the result of previous causes and conditions. If you can, put it in the comments below. Every existent thing in reality that we can see, both internal and external, is the result of some previous set of causes and conditions. And if we look at any of those previous causes and conditions, they themselves also are the result of previous causes and conditions. So this is not some Buddhist idea coming out of nowhere. This is how it actually is when you look at reality. And Buddhists simply say, that doesn't start at the Big Bang. There's no beginning to this. Before the Big Bang, it's like that also. How do we know? Well, logically we can establish that. And also, the Buddha and other great saints like Venerable Mahabua and some that I put up in Yogis of Tibet, there's a couple of them that mention something like this. When our great saints look at their past rebirths, they see that there are infinite universes going back behind this one. This is what they say. You know, that's maybe not a good reason for you, but logically, all of the evidence of our experience shows when I have a fruit, it came from a tree. Where did the tree come from? Well, it came from a whole bunch of causes and conditions, including a seed. Well, where did that seed come from? Well, it came from something like a fruit prior to it. Well, where did that come from? Well, it came from a tree prior to that. Every single thing is dependent upon causes and conditions, not just one uncaused, causeless, explanationless thing that brings everything else into being. There's nothing like this in reality anywhere that you can observe whatsoever. And so Buddhists are saying, prior to the beginning of this universe, it was also like that. Let's carry on.
Most famous summary of this doctrine is this little thing they say: when this is, that is. This arising, that arises. When this is not, that is not. This ceasing, that ceases. Now, this doctrine is intended to show that everything has a cause and everything, therefore, is conditional. Nothing exists which can ever be called a first cause or an external cause. Now, think about this as a Christian. There's no place to say, for example, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, that implies someone outside of time and space who who acts into the world and creates and begins something, a sovereign God that's beyond time, space, and in fact himself not part of any chain of causality.
As I said in the other video, this doesn't solve the problem of why is there something rather than nothing. You're still saying there's a something. It's not a material something, but you're saying there's a something that exists, and we're just stuck with no explanation for why there is this something instead of nothing. But your explanation breaks all of the laws and rules of reality as we understand them. The Buddhist explanation says, look at the world as you see it. Every single cause comes from previous causes. Period. There's no exceptions. What brings the universe into being in the beginning of this particular universe, creating the heavens and the earth, is the mental continuums of beings who were living in the previous universe and the karma of those beings working individually and collectively to create the current universe. This is what creates the heavens and the earth, according to Buddhism. Why is that universe fine-tuned for their existence? Because it comes into being due to the collective action of the beings who are going to be reborn into that universe. So we also have an immaterial cause. We also have an explanation for fine-tuning. And if you'd like to know more, you got to go look at the other video.
The second doctrine in the second sermon is known as Anatman, which means no soul. And this is the denial that there is any reality in us. The Hindus believe that all of life was invented by an internal principle called Atman. This is Anatman, means no Atman. This is the ultimate. Buddhism is a reaction movement against Hinduism. So they're responding against the fundamental teachings of Hinduism by rejecting the nature of the soul. So there's no inside individual spirit or anything like this that's eternal in Buddhism. And therefore, Buddhism is considered to be a non-theistic religion. They do not believe.
There's just so much I need to respond to there, and I would have to talk for 30 minutes to respond to it all. Briefly, Hinduism didn't exist at the time that Buddhism came into existence. That's the first point. Secondly, the idea of Anatman, not self, is something that is in the Pali Canon, so that's part of the first turning of the wheel. What's mainly being attacked, let's say, in the second turning of the wheel is svabhava, inherent essence, which is a slightly different object than Atman, or self, as it is defined in Buddhist texts, which is quite different than how it's defined in modern Hindu texts. And then by the time we get to the third turning of the wheel, we're talking about the inseparability of the apprehender and what is apprehended, which I'll get into in a moment. And so the solution to suffering is changing slightly in each case. However, in all cases, all of these systems say there is something that carries on from lifetime to lifetime. If there wasn't, how do you carry all this karma? What exactly is the Buddha talking about when he says, I recalled all of my past lives? What's being discussed there is a causal chain of conscious events. So in Buddhism, there is a chain of conscious events called a mind stream, in which the previous moment of your awareness causes the next moment of your awareness at a fundamental level. And it's that consciousness that carries on from lifetime to lifetime. So how long has that consciousness existed? Forever. It's an eternal chain. So you have an eternal, in some very important sense, soul. And even according to the Christians, if we're talking about a soul, Christians think, I am going to heaven. What does that mean? That my mind, my memories, who I am, all of this stuff that makes me up in terms of my awareness is going to carry on to my next existence. And there is a huge amount in common between the Buddhist idea of a mind stream carrying on and that idea. So, no, that's just not accurate. Next, Buddhism is a theistic religion that rejects creator gods. Buddhist texts, generally speaking, until the modern period, in all of my studies from all traditions, never described deities as being just a figment of your imagination or illusions or something like this. There are real deities. Deities exist in a hierarchy of beings. They are more powerful than human beings. Sometimes they get involved in the world. It's even possible for you to be reborn into the heavenly realms of those beings. And the Buddha gives instructions for people who would like to be reborn in various heavenly realms. He gives them instructions on how to do this. You can find all this material in the Pali Canon. There's just so much wrong with what's being said here. It's hard to decide what to respond to and how to respond to it. Again, I know he's speaking to a beginner audience, but humbly I request theologians, especially at the level of a university, talking to students who are meant to really understand these things, please, please, please try to get the basics correct. Yeah.
Believe in God or a first cause of anything. And so all the gods and goddesses that come out in Buddhism in various ways are all illusory. They are human projections. They're part of the whole nexus of cause and effect.
Simply because something depends upon causes and effects does not mean it's an illusion. It has qualities that are like an illusion if you see it existing a way it doesn't exist. What do I mean? Think about a mirage. A mirage exists as a perceptual phenomenon when light, if I'm not mistaken, refracts off of a little bit of water in the air and appears as a shimmering across the ground that can be mistaken for liquid water, drinkable water. The mirage, its appearance by itself, is not an illusion. But the fact that when you go and look inside the mirage that there's no water, that's an illusion. When you think that things exist in and of themselves, without depending upon causes and conditions, when you think that, and when you see things existing in that way, they are illusion-like in your perception. Because when you investigate them closely, you won't find them existing independent of causes and conditions. You'll only find them existing within causes and conditions.
Was Theravada Buddhism, which required the Eightfold Path I mentioned earlier, was a monastic path. Well, because that actually turned back into another form of Brahminical kind of elitism, there was a dissent movement that rose up known as Mahayana, means the great vehicle. And Mahayana is today the large body of Buddhism. 85% of Buddhism would be Mahayana, even though all of Buddhism doesn't really have a difference in terms of their overall ontological views. This great vehicle, or Mahayana Buddhism, is... This
was made before the most recent archaeological findings about Gandharan texts. Gandharan texts indicate that Theravada and Mahayana teachings, roughly speaking, jumping over some sticky issues in language there, were existing at the same time at the earliest periods of Buddhism that we can discover archaeologically. And there are Mahayana sutras that go back to, I believe it's the 2nd century BCE, before the Common Era. In fact, the very earliest sutra that we have is a Mahayana sutra. Now, what has happened over the centuries is that Mahayana has developed different types of practices and different institutions that has, in a practical sense, separated it from its Theravada contemporaries. And so I don't accept that Theravada and Mahayana teachings have been divided in quite the way that he's describing here. Let's carry on.
Has a huge emphasis on ethics. Because what they believe is, back to this wheel, they believe that certain people that had gone through all of this training and meditation through the Eightfold Path, they've been monks, they got to the point of stepping off the wheel of samsara, off this wheel of suffering, and rather than stepping off and going to nirvana, which is nothingness, the idea of blowing out, instead, they believe that they stepped back on the wheel of samsara. They came back into the world in order to help assist other people and to bring others to enlightenment. So these become enlightened figures known as bodhisattvas.
Okay. Nirvana is not nothingness. Nirvana is, according to the Pali sources, if you look at the commentaries, if I can find it, I'll put it on the screen. If not, just hear me out. When you look at the 12 links that cause out-of-control rebirth in samsara, one of them is consciousness. But the type of consciousness that's occurring there would be a corollary to your human mind with your human sense faculties, for example. There are other types of consciousness that bring you to this lifetime. There's a type of awareness that occurs before you get to this life. You don't just plink out of existence at the end of this life and then karma carried by what? Nothing? Gives rise? No. You have a type of consciousness that is different from your human consciousness, your human awareness, that's still in the same continuum of consciousness as this awareness, but is not this awareness. It's subtler, carries on from lifetime to lifetime, carrying your karma, and that then gives rise to the next being that you become. So when you attain nirvana and blow out or extinguish the causes for this type of existence that is out of control rebirth, then you simply abide in the nature of your consciousness, the more fundamental type of consciousness, fully satisfied within your own being, in an incredible state of bliss for, well, according to the Theravadan tradition, forever. You have attained a state that is absolutely perfect for your needs. Absolutely incredible. From that standpoint, what if you wanted to benefit other beings and attain samyak sambodhi, unexcelled, complete enlightenment? Then you would need to generate compassion, because in this state of mind that is nirvana, you've eliminated the causes for generating the normal type of existence that we would come into just out of rote habit of karma and instinct and so forth. Since that's been eliminated, your mind will abide in its own nature and won't come out of its own nature of bliss and so forth, unless there's some other cause bringing it out. So what is this other cause? Compassion. So the primary thing that then drives you to take on new existence is not your previous negative karma and your previous delusions and so forth. It's compassion that causes you to pull yourself out of this condition and carry on training and helping people. When you come out of that condition, your mind is still in nirvana because you have completely removed all of the causes of suffering from your own mind. You've destroyed this cycle of suffering. It's gone. So your mind remains perfect for your needs, but you're now driven by compassion to take on various bodies or to appear in various ways, according to Buddhists, that are beneficial to others. In no way whatsoever are you simply diving back into this out-of-control cycle of suffering to try to help people. That would be like diving headfirst into quicksand to help someone get out of quicksand. That's insane. What you need to do is get yourself out of the quicksand. Once you're out, you're out. And then you get a rope and you throw it to somebody so that you can help pull them out. That's compassion. So bodhisattvas don't give up their own nirvana. They give up abiding nirvana and enter into non-abiding nirvana. This is an absolutely critical difference that has to be understood if you want to understand Mahayana Buddhism. So you have to pull yourself out of the problem, and then, while you're on the other shore, to use the Buddhist analogy, then you help people. You pull other people out of compassion, not out of compulsion born of previous negative karmas. Yeah? Let's continue.
Someone who has an oil lamp, and they have it filled with oil, and the oil in this case represents desire. All of us have desires. And so they extinguish those desires, which they quit putting new oil in the lamp. So the lamp will burn for a long time. And eventually, if you don't put any more oil in it, eventually the flame will start getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And at some point, the flame will go out, and there's a little wisp of smoke. And Buddha said, that is nirvana. It's the going into nothingness. Now, the Buddhism actually debated this point a lot, actually, what exactly is nirvana. And it actually fell out ultimately, like a lot of things, into two major schools of thought. One school is called the Madhyamaka, and they believe that
oh, goodness gracious. Sorry, I just have to jump in there. This is so confused. I'm genuinely, I'm not trying to be harsh, but my goodness, this is not good. So, non-existence can't exist. All of the things that don't exist are already quite busy filling up non-existence. There's no room for anything else, as I heard somewhere recently. So, non-existence is, by definition, something that doesn't exist. You can't take a causal continuum of mental stuff that has existed from all time and make it non-existent. The previous moment of your consciousness is what brings the next moment of consciousness into being, not your ignorance. Your ignorance is something that is occurring in consciousness. Ignorance is the cause of all of the klesha, the disturbing emotions that lead to karma, that lead to out-of-control rebirth. All of those things are in your mind. So you can't cause your mind to go out of being by getting rid of the stuff that keeps the cycle of rebirth going. That doesn't make any sense. The causal continuum of your mind is there, and within that causal continuum is some stuff that is problematic for you. When you remove that, then within that mind stream, you have a state of satisfaction that's stable for you. These two positions he's about to describe are the second and third turnings of the wheel of Buddhism. The first turning, again, was the Four Noble Truths. The second turning is the ontological truth, the truth of how things exist when you're just looking at them of themselves, which is called the Middle Way School. And then there's the third turning of the wheel, which then includes the consciousness that is being aware of how things exist as part of the equation of it. It's almost like the epistemological turn in Western philosophy, for those who are a bit nerdy, where you start with the analysis of things as they are in and of themselves, and that's the second turning. And then the third turning is, while we're doing this investigation of things in and of themselves, how is our mind that is knowing this information involved? How is our epistemological state involved in knowing this information? What's the exact relationship between those two? In brief, I would say that's sort of what's going on in a sense for the third turning. So if I had to boil it down in the way that he's trying to boil it down here, you have the three turnings: Four Noble Truth, Middle Way, and the Mind-Only School. Middle Way and Mind-Only, generally speaking, are Mahayana teachings, and generally speaking, the first turning, Four Noble Truths, is a Theravada teaching. However, the first turning, Four Noble Truths, is also part of the Mahayana. So if it was a ladder, this is where the Theravada stops at Nirvana. And then if you want to attain Buddhahood, you keep climbing the ladder until you've achieved all of the capabilities that can be attained for the benefit of others. So the difference is not one of radical separation. You have to accomplish all of the same stuff right up here to the point of Nirvana, and then carry on and do more things, rather than absorbing into your own fundamental nature. So this is the major difference. And roughly, this is how these schools fit together. Let's continue.
What that nirvana is what they call Shunyata, which means nothingness. Nothingness. It's emptiness. There is nothing. So again, back to the whole thing. No first cause, there's nothing. So all we are karmic constituents. There's no self, there's no you. They say regularly, the Eightfold Path exists, but no traveler on it. Suffering exists, but no actual sufferer.
All you are is the stuff that makes you up. Therefore, there's no you. What kind of argument is this? Genuinely. And since there's only stuff that makes you up, you're nothing. How do you come to these kinds of conclusions? These I'm genuinely at a loss. The Buddha taught the way you see yourself, no matter which system you're talking about, if you're talking about first, second, or third turning, the way you see yourself has certain cognitive errors in it. There are ways of seeing yourself that are mistaken. The big one is you think that you are utterly independent in some way of causes and conditions. The proof of this is, I'll give you two quick experiments. Imagine your best friend. Imagine that your mind was put in their body. Now imagine that your mind wasn't your mind. It was someone else's mind. Does it still feel like you're there somehow? Even though you don't have the same body at all, and the mind that's in the body now is also completely different, but somehow you're still there, right? There's a sense that there's a me that can be separated from the body and separated from the mind. That me doesn't exist when you look for it. However, you, as he said, are in fact all of these other things that make you up. You're a stream of consciousness, you're a stream of physical parts, you're a stream of karmic causality. These are the things that are making you up. That's what you are. You aren't your best friend. You aren't the table. There's a lot of things that you aren't. Most of reality is not you. There's a few little parts in this corner of reality that are making up you. And those parts don't exist in the way that you think they do. The way that you think they exist, if we were to isolate that concept of a self, that particular self, completely non-existent. But when you look, you are here. I mean, the Buddha again said, I was reborn countless times. I was reborn. I recalled my past lives where I was such and such. Who is this I? It's the continuum of consciousness going from lifetime to lifetime. It's a causal process. There's no independent person that exists outside that process in the way that it appears. If you haven't investigated it closely, those aren't there, but there is in fact a beginningless, eternal, causal chain of conscious events that is what makes you up. So to say that you don't exist is absolutely nonsense. Furthermore, when you read a text and it says something like, there's suffering but no sufferer, there is traveling the path but no traveler, what they're referring to there is your mistaken perception of how a traveler exists. You think there's something utterly independent of body and mind that exists as a traveler, when in point of fact, when you look for such a thing, you can't find something existing that way. So that one doesn't exist. But there is a traveler that exists in the midst of traveling. There is a self that exists as a set of parts that are constantly changing in a continuum that is not other continuums of parts. This is another one of those absolutely critical points that is not mysticism. It's not actually that hard to grasp. You have a cognitive error. You see things in a way that they don't exist. All of the times where we're saying that self doesn't exist, this person doesn't exist, the one who's doing this action doesn't exist, we're referring to your cognitive error. We're not referring to how things exist in reality. How things exist in reality is a bunch of causes and conditions that come together, including you. Yeah? Okay, let's carry on.
And so you go into nothingness. The other group felt like that was a bit nihilistic, potentially. You think? And so they objected and said, actually, this is the Yogacara group. This is the second big group, Yogacara. They said that actually what Nirvana is actually a storehouse of consciousness, which means that all reality is in your mind. Okay, so this would be what would call in philosophy solipsism. So this is the idea that all reality that we see is actually projections from our own mind.
No. So Yogacara, despite being called mind only, argues, here's the big point of debate for those who are interested, not that there are no external objects, but rather that the apprehender and apprehended have a single nature. So this is very different than saying they are the same thing. The front of a coin and the back of a coin are not the same. They're not the same thing. But you can't pull them apart without losing the coin. The coin goes away if you cut it in half. Now you just have two halves of a coin. You don't have a coin anymore. So in the same way, the Chittamatrans say, I don't want to get too complicated on you, but there's a storehouse of consciousness, and within that consciousness, within that storehouse of consciousness, are all of these karmic seeds. And every time one of these karmic seeds sprouts, it has two leaves. And one leaf is the conscious experience of a particular object, and the other leaf is the object itself. So there is an object itself. Chittamatra says there are three natures. One of those natures is that the external world has all of these causes and conditions that are ticking along. That's not just in your head. That's certainly not just in your mind. That's certainly not just a projection of your mind. Each time an experience is had, the mind and the object are coming from the same seed over and over like this. But there are actually physical objects arising. It's not just all in your head. This could arguably be called some type of neutral monism, potentially. The Madhyamakas, the middle way, are saying there are different karmas that ripen, that produce the physical world and your mental events. This is quite different than saying, for the Madhyamakas, nothing exists whatsoever. No, Madhyamakas are saying that everything exists interdependently, and the Chittamatrans are agreeing with this, but they're also saying, more fundamentally than this, that each karmic seed, each seed produces both a knower and a known at the same time. The knower and known are actually a mental thing and a physical thing. There is a world out there, but if you were to remove the knower, the known would also disappear. The actual physical object connected to that knower would also disappear. And vice versa, if you were to remove the known, the thing that is knowing that would also disappear. And there's some important insights to be had in that discussion. One famous koan related to this is, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, if the object of sound arises from the same seed as the consciousness that knows the sound, then if the consciousness that knows sound isn't present when the conditions that under which a sound would normally occur, right, a tree falling, if a type of consciousness is not present that can be aware of sounds, then no sounds can occur. And I think modern cognitive science would agree with this. The middle way philosophers would also agree, but they just have different reasons for why they say this is. So according to this view, the Chittamatra view, the external world is not just in your head, it's not just mental, but physical things are coming from the storehouse consciousness from moment to moment. In the Prasangika view, the external world is coming into existence due to other causes and conditions, including the collective karma of all sentient beings bringing a new universe into existence, whereby those causes and conditions externally, physically, carry on doing their own thing, roughly speaking. So how you get solipsism from that, I can't say. Okay, let's carry on.
That's really the only two options you have in Buddhism, either nothingness, Shunyata, or consciousness, all of reality, all that we know is a shared consciousness. Well, from a Christian point of view, this is very, very difficult. The Yogacara says, for example, when Christians...
From a Buddhist point of view, that's a straw man. Okay, let's carry on.
Talk about God, for example. When we say God did this, or God is love, or God is alive, we're like a person, they say, that's like shouting from the rim of a canyon. And you, as you've done this, I'm sure, you shout out across the canyon, you hear the echo back, and you think it's somebody else, but actually it's nothing but the projection of yourself. So God is simply the echo off of a canyon wall. The Madhyamikas say, well, it's actually more like the image of a mirror. You look into a mirror and you see something that you think has reality, but actually it has no reality. It's just a reflection of yourself.
Once again, I do apologize. The renderings of those are so poor, humbly and respectfully, that I don't really know how to salvage the way that he's described them there. A creator deity is a wrong view. So a wrong view is a philosophical system that is fully developed, that you believe is correct because you have assessed a number of lines of evidence and reasoning that at some point along the way contain errors. And wrong views, according to Buddhism, then lead you down the path of doing a bunch of other things that don't make sense, including problems with ethics and other things. The discussion of echoes can be related to this whole discussion of emptiness philosophy and non-duality. It can also be related to karma. Again, just the way this has been used, I really don't know how to salvage it. It's just not the way that it's used in Buddhism. Furthermore, the analogy of the mirror, once again, the way it's being used here doesn't make a lot of sense. I can spend a little bit of time on it, though. Consider a mirror, just to use this as a teaching moment. A mirror never actually has an image in it. This is something you really have to think about. The image you see on a mirror is light that bounced off of something, hit the mirror, and arrived at your eye. If you'd like a really weird version of this, put a piece of fruit on a piece of paper on a mirror and then look at it from the side. And in the mirror, you'll see the fruit behind the piece of paper. This is really cool. I might put it on the screen. A mirror never actually has an image on it whatsoever. The image is something that your mind does interpreting the light that is bounced off the mirror. It is reflecting light. It's reflective. That's what it does. So the image is something that occurs in your perception. You see? And so this is one of those analogies that's used to say, we know there are things in our perception that look like they exist in and of themselves without depending upon causes and conditions. When you look at the mirror, it just looks like there's stuff in the mirror. But as soon as you investigate a little bit, there's nothing inside the mirror that exists in that way. In order to explain what appears in the mirror, you have to investigate a whole bunch of causes and conditions that are not intuitive to you at all. When you look at a mountain, for example, it seems as if the mountain exists in and of itself. It seems like the mountain exists with its own nature. It's out there. It has nothing to do with me. It took millions of years to get here, blah, blah, blah. But as soon as you ask any questions about the nature of that mountain's existence, you run into all sorts of weird problems. Like, where does the mountain stop? You say there's this huge mountain out there that's completely obvious, has nothing to do with me and you. Where does it begin and end exactly? Does it stop in the foothills? Does it stop when it's completely flat? When a rock breaks off of the stone there, are all of the rocks on the surface of the mountain not the mountain anymore? If a rock is falling down the mountain, when does it stop being the mountain and start just being a rock? What about the rocks that are in the river on the mountain? Are those part of the mountain or not? And where exactly when they start breaking off, if it's part of the mountain, but the water is running over it, where exactly when it's breaking off does it stop being the mountain and start just being a rock? When and where exactly does all of this occur? The more you try to scratch the surface of what this mountain is, where it is, blah, 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 you can't find it, as huge and old and ancient and seemingly obvious as it is. The reason for this is that a mountain is an interdependent phenomenon, and we don't have enough time to discuss the full solution to this. But mountains are real. They depend upon causes and conditions, and they exist in a way that's counterintuitive. In the same way that when you look at your face in the mirror, it seems to just be there on the surface of the mirror or be inside the mirror somewhere. But as soon as you start scratching the surface, you go, oh, wow, yeah. If this mirror broke, it's not like there's a face in there somewhere. And by the way, if somebody was standing over here, they're not going to see the same stuff I'm seeing. So there's no one particular image on the surface of this mirror. And so there, you can create an analogy between these two. When you look at it, it appears to exist in one way, but when you investigate it, it actually exists in a completely different counterintuitive way. So that's the analogy of the mirror, roughly speaking, used in this context. The mirror can also be used in a meditative context. When we're talking about the fundamental properties of consciousness, we can talk about it being like a mirror in that it allows things to appear, but that's a different subject. Let's carry on.
The Zen Buddhists, which is a particular school of Buddhism you may be familiar with from Japan that came to the Western world, is the meditative Buddhism, and they have a saying that goes like this: if you should meet the Buddha on the road, you should kill him. A little surprising. It's a very famous Zen saying. You can Google it, just don't do it now. But in the Zen world, what they mean by that is that if you think the Buddha is somebody, then you've missed the whole point of Buddhism. It's not the Buddha, the historical Buddha, because the Buddha has no reality ultimately. It's only the teachings of the Buddha, the truths of the Buddha. So this lecture,
my goodness. My heart mentor for 12 years was a very serious Zen practitioner. He had trained in Zen for about 30 years, something like this. This expression does not mean that the Buddha is nothing or nobody. What it means is that your exaggerated perception of the Buddha is also something that you need to overcome. So the same way that you misperceive the mountain, which is huge, vast, it's not huge and vast. It's not this ancient, incredible thing. It is all of those things. But you still, nonetheless, have this misperception of how the mountain exists. You need to kill that. You need to completely destroy that misperception of how you think the mountain exists if you want to be liberated from all of the problems that this cognitive error causes in your perception and your emotions and your thinking and everything else. And of course, your rebirths, right? To put it in less confronting terms, you think the Buddha exists inherently in and of himself with his own properties that have nothing to do with anything else. That's mistaken. Simply being attached to the Buddha and exaggerating his qualities with the same types of misperceptions that you have of everything else won't fix your problem. So you have to kill that Buddha that is this misperception of the Buddha. Let's continue.
It is commonly stated around the world that Buddhism, high point is the role of ethics. Buddhism is a compassionate religion. Their writings are filled with exhortations to show compassion on all living things. They're often touted as this is the place where ethics, where Christians and Buddhists can meet and find common ground. And as I said, last two lectures, I found that whenever you discuss common ground, we always have this challenge as Christians because we come face to face with Christ and what Christ meets for us when we talk about things like compassion or ethics. So I want to mention two serious challenges that Christians face when discussing ethics with Buddhists. The first is this: it's very difficult to have a proper ethical view if you deny the reality of the self. Listen, in the Christian worldview, the whole of ethics is built around, and this would be like what you would assume must be true for everyone, but in fact it's a Christian view, that ethics is built around the idea that the person who shows acts of mercy and kindness and compassion, and there's also someone who is the recipient of all those actions. The incarnation is a real thing, and therefore it enlivens and empowers and honors all such actions where you enter into someone's world. Christ didn't become a generic man, he became a specific man. So in the Christian world, every form of ethics, properly understood, is the incarnation in seed form. If you participate in a soup kitchen to help feed the hungry, if you help to rescue women who've been caught in human trafficking, you are the acting agent motivated by the love of Christ, and your act of compassion is actually being received by someone created in the image of God who has dignity before God. Now in Buddhism, despite all of the lofty language that we often encounter, there is no I who acts, and there's no thou who receives the action. There's no relationship because neither ever existed. There's actually only illusory cause of chain of ignorance in the whole chain of existence. Ethics in Buddhism only functions on the provisional level, not...
Okay, I have to jump in. In Buddhism, you exist. You exist as a dependent arising. What doesn't exist is a you that exists beyond dependent arising. This is a very, very, very simple point. The way you exist is different from how you think. In the same way that when you look at the mirror, it looks like there's just a face there and it's on the surface of the mirror or it's inside the mirror. But as soon as you look for it, it's not there in that way. It exists as a dependent set of causal relationships that depends partly on you, partly on the mirror, partly on the stuff being reflected. That's how it exists, which is not how it looks. It looks very different from this. Likewise, when you look at yourself, you see yourself as existing independent of causes and conditions in the way being described in Buddhism. And if you investigate, you'll find out that there's no part of you that exists in the way that it appears. It exists in a different way than it appears. And all of those things that exist actually exist in this way that is different from how they appear and make you up are you. So there's a you. So who's giving you this advice or whatever today? I am. Who's receiving it? You are. If you go to a soup kitchen and you do some work there, you're doing the work, and the people receiving it are the ones receiving it. This is not actually counterintuitive at all. And how do those people exist? As sets of causes and conditions. What doesn't exist is a giver that exists independent of causes and conditions. What doesn't exist is a recipient who exists independent of causes and conditions. What doesn't exist is an act of giving that exists independent of the giver, what is being given, and the one it is being given to. For the action of giving to exist, there has to be a giver, a recipient, and the thing being given. There's no action that exists independent of these conditions. That would be absurd. What could it possibly mean that there's an action of giving if there was nothing that was being given? What could it possibly mean if there was nobody giving anything and yet somehow there was somebody giving something? What could it possibly mean if there was giving but there was no recipient of any kind for what was being given? The argument is that all of these things exist in sets of dependent relationships that if you try to pull them apart, you lose all the parts. You don't just lose one part by pulling it apart, you lose all of the parts that are involved in that specific thing. In the same way, just a really coarse example, you right now are your body and mind. If someone takes away your body, you cease to exist. If someone takes away your mind, your body will be dead and you cease to exist, as you are now. And your mind will go on and become someone and something else, according to Buddhism. So again, this isn't like super counterintuitive, weird, out there, mystical, you don't exist, nothing exists. All of this is really, really bad reasoning, first of all. And if this is what Buddhism was teaching, it wouldn't have survived to the modern period. It couldn't have made it. The philosophers in India were way too sharp. They would have destroyed that in a matter of generations. And the Buddha explicitly rejects that you don't have a self. I'm going to put it on the screen. This is one example, but there are countless examples. What I am rejecting is this wrong view of the self. What I'm also rejecting is that there's no self whatsoever. I'm rejecting annihilationism and I'm rejecting eternalism. This is something you have to get right if you want to criticize Buddhism. I think I'm really well qualified to criticize Buddhism if I wanted to. But you have to understand the basics of the views you're critiquing if you want to have a genuine critique of the views. Let's carry on.
This is the Lotus Sutra, one of the most influential Mahayana texts in the Far East. In the Lotus Sutra, one of the stories they tell is a man who comes home to find his house is on fire. He's a wealthy man. He lives in a beautiful mansion, many rooms, and he is, of course, shocked to find his house on fire. But inside the house, his children are playing with, in the upstairs rooms and are oblivious to the horrible danger that they're in. So the father realized he must act quickly in order to get his children out. He can't take time to reason with them. So instead, what he does, he calls up to the windows of the children and he cries out, because he knows every child. He knows what toy would most entice them. So he cries out to each child and tells them, if you come out, I will give you this toy. And of course, the children run out and they are therefore delivered from the flames. This is the Lotus Sutra. Now, the Buddha is compared to that wise father. Like the wise father, according to the Buddhist, Buddha understands the particular needs of each person, and his teaching or his dharma calls out to each one in its own way. The toys are symbolic of the various ethical acts of compassion which are necessary to lead each of us out of our illusory play into the safety of enlightenment. Thus, even the bodhisattva or the enlightened Buddhist who knows there's no self who is compassionate, there's no self who receives compassion, but they engage in ethical acts in order to reach the real goal, which is transcending the self.
So this story from the Lotus Sutra isn't actually toys that he's promising his children. It's particular types of carts that are pulled by different kinds of animals. And in particular, he offers 3 different carts, one for each of his children. The carts represent the different goals that the Buddha taught for different students. So the Buddha taught 3 different goals that are the final goals of Buddhism, beyond simply having a nice rebirth, which is also sort of a minor goal. The first is Nirvana for oneself only. So these are called hearers because they hear the teachings, they pursue Nirvana, and they attain Nirvana, and they get out of samsara. And they abide in their own nirvanic state, as I was saying earlier. They abide in that condition that's perfect for them, and that's the end of the road. Then there are Pratyeka Buddhas, the solitary realizer Buddhas, who spend a little bit more time accumulating wider sets of causes and conditions so that they can be reborn in a time where there are no Buddhas. And in that place and time, they then attain nirvana in their last life as a solitary realizer, without other Buddhas around and without other people teaching this stuff, in order to inspire and create connections with other beings who wouldn't otherwise have connections with the Buddha's teachings. And then there's Samyak Sambuddhas, the unsurpassed fully enlightened Buddha path, where one attains omniscience, incredible compassion, and incredible abilities to benefit others through manifesting oneself in countless forms, etc. This is what's being taught. So when the Buddha is calling out to the children are us ordinary beings. The Buddha says, look, I have 3 different vehicles you can jump into that you're really going to love, and these are the favorite vehicles for the different children that are around. Some want just what they can get for themselves. Some want to help a few people, but mostly just want to get out for themselves. And then the last ones, all they want to do is help other beings. So these are the 3 vehicles. And then the Lotus Sutra says, actually, even though the Buddha is guiding you towards the 3 vehicles, ultimately, he's guiding you towards the one vehicle, which is just the Mahayana. So there's this idea in Mahayana Buddhism that the Buddha teaches 3 vehicles, and that along the way towards attaining nirvana, or after attaining nirvana even, the Buddha will intervene in that process and take you onto the Mahayana path. He diverts you at some point in another rebirth, or after you've attained nirvana, will wake you up out of your nirvanic state to carry on until you attain full enlightenment. So the real point with the Lotus Sutra in this passage is that there's actually one vehicle, but the Buddha teaches 2 easier vehicles so that people who have no inclination to help other people beyond helping a few people in this lifetime, or a few people as a solitary realizer, for those people, let me give you some goals that will take you, as I was saying with the Bodhisattva path, right? Will take you to here. You're climbing the ladder, and we'll get you all the way to here, and then once you're at this level of development, I'll tell you how to climb the rest of the ladder from there. So I don't know what the point is he's trying to make, but he's certainly not making the point that this sutra is trying to make. Let's carry on.
Buddhist ethics is the raft which carries us across the river and gets you to the empty bank, which is considered nothingness or nirvana. When you get across the river, you don't need the raft. You discard the raft. It's no longer necessary. It had only functional purpose. Now, as Christians, when we hear things like this, we remember...
Okay. I thought I was going to be able to let him go for a little bit there, but I've got to jump in again. The parable of the raft, which I'll either link below or put on the screen, is not simply in regards to ethics. It's in regards to the entire Eightfold Path. So the analogy goes like this. You're walking through the woods. You don't have any gear with you to get across a river if you happen to come upon one. And yet you do. You come across this river and it's in your way and you need to get across. And so you look on the bank and you find all of this sort of junk lying on the shore, leaves and vines and sticks and logs and stuff, and you lash it all together and you make a makeshift raft that can take you from one shore to the other. And then once you get to the other shore, you give up the raft You don't take it with you. It's just something you put together on the fly to be able to get across. And then once you're across, you leave it and carry on your journey. Formalized Buddhist ethics, in the sense of, for example, taking the 5 pratimoksha vows, is not something you need to maintain after you have realizations. Why? You don't have to have a vow not to lie anymore. You just don't lie anymore. You have accomplished these practices. The Buddha is saying once you have attained the actual goals of the practices, which by the way for most of us will be a multiple lifetime affair, sorry to say. Imagine, for example, you had a broken leg. You can't walk on it, you can't function normally because your leg is in a bad position. You have some surgery done on it, you put a cast on it. How silly would you be if, when your leg was fully healed, let's say it got fully recovered? How silly would you be if you then, every 6 months, had it cut open again just for fun? Or if you kept the cast on it just for fun? Buddhas are perfectly ethical, so they don't need to have ethical commitments that stop them from doing unethical things. Buddhas are perfectly generous, so they don't need an ethical commitment to encourage them to be generous rather than stingy. Buddhas are perfectly persevering in their activities, so they don't need a bunch of methods that help them motivate themselves to be more persevering. Buddhas are perfectly patient, and so they don't need a bunch of methods and help figuring out how to be patient with the various difficulties and so forth of sentient beings in the process of teaching. So what you're abandoning are the methods that allowed you to accomplish something. You're not abandoning the accomplishments. Am I making my point?
Remember that metaphors which compare ethics to a raft or to non-existent toys, which the Father promises, all the idea of ethics as a temporary God demotes ethics to a functional level. Ethical actions don't actually exist. They're temporarily useful in the context of the world's illusion for the sake of a higher goal. Thus, by Buddhist own admission, Buddhist ethics is not about alleviating human suffering at all, since there is no one suffering. The goal of Buddhist ethics is not to assist.
I've already addressed most of this, but you do exist. Once you attain the perfection of ethics, it means that you don't need to have an ethical system that is guiding you anymore because your actions are already ethical by nature. That doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. It means that you have no inclination whatsoever in any atom of your being to do things that are unethical. So you no longer need guardrails that stop you from doing bad things and force you to do good things because you have conflicting motivations and desires. Those conflicting motivations and desires are gone, and so you just carry on with ethical behavior all the time. That's just how you are. And there is somebody who is the recipient of your ethical or unethical actions, and there is someone who's carrying out your ethical and unethical actions. You. Let's carry on.
This inevitably admires Buddhist ethics into a negative assessment of humanity. Now, ethics are not directed toward a real person and has therefore no innate worth and dignity. There's no self, there's no one to be valued or attributed dignity.
As a sentient being, according to Buddhism, you have an innate desire for lasting, meaningful happiness that we call liberation or nirvana. Innately, you want your mind to be satisfied. You want your mind to be stable. You want your mind to be blissful and uplifted rather than the opposite. Likewise, you don't want to experience unnecessary, meaningless types of suffering. And you certainly don't want to chase things around that you think will cause happiness, but in fact cause suffering. So in this way, all beings have an innate right for this type of happiness because you have the innate desire for this kind of happiness. And everyone has the innate right for freedom from suffering because you have the innate desire for this freedom from suffering. This is the basis of human dignity. And if you think of people like this, then even if you have to put them in prison, for example, which causes a temporary kind of suffering, in order to protect other people from a much greater form of suffering, for example, then those people that you've put in prison, you're not going to torture them. You're not going to leave them languishing. You're going to do everything you can in that circumstance where some of their freedoms have been restricted to ensure that they actually develop as a person and become more functional. Because if that criminal was fully happy, fully satisfied, they would never harm anyone again. And there are famous examples of this in the Buddhist canon. Look at Angulimala. He was a serial killer, and he met the Buddha. The Buddha convinced him very rapidly that killing a bunch of people was not the right thing to be doing. And there's a really interesting story about why he started killing people in the first place. But the Buddha convinces him he needs to stop, and he does stop. And then he becomes a monk. And then he gives up all harm to all other beings. And then he attains liberation and was harmless for the rest of his life. And in fact, helped a lot of people. If you have a sense that all beings have a natural right for deep, lasting, meaningful kinds of happiness, not just temporary, flippant pleasures, and a deep, lasting, meaningful alleviation of suffering, then you will naturally treat others with dignity, even if they're criminals, even if they've harmed others. So I just can't agree. I do not agree that we don't have a way to establish human dignity in Buddhism. And once again, the idea that, well, nobody exists at all, so it doesn't matter if you're suffering or happy. Well, then why did the Buddha teach for 40 years? What would be the purpose of all of that if his final realization was none of this matters and nobody exists and we're not doing anything and no one's here? I mean, let's carry on.
Now, the Christian point of view, of course, is that if even the simplest act of a child, all the way up to the vicarious sufferings of Christ on the cross and everything in between, these cannot be declared illusory or like a dream, another one of their images. If you feed the hungry,
It also can't be declared illusory in Buddhism. It's not illusory. It's not illusory. I'd say it a third time. It's not illusory. None of these are illusions. All phenomena, including ethics, share some properties in common with illusions because we have a cognitive error that sees them existing utterly independent of causes and conditions. Ethics is not an illusion. The people you're engaging with are not an illusion, nor are they a dream. They are illusion-like and dream-like in that, for example, regardless of what you think theologically or philosophically, if you ask a cognitive scientist, what you see in front of you as colors and shapes and the sounds that you hear, the smells that you smell, the tastes that you taste, the tactile sensations you have, etc., your senses interpret data from the external world, to put it sort of broadly. The properties of the thing itself can't be pulled apart or separated from your mind. Reality is like a dream in that the qualities of things depend in part upon your mind in the same way that they depend on your mind fully in a dream. Reality itself is not a dream. And if you think it is, you're going to do some really dumb things. You're going to hurt yourself. You're going to hurt other people. Reality is not a dream. Reality is not an illusion. It's like an illusion in that when you look at a mountain, it is huge. It seems ancient, it is in your face, and as soon as you start looking for where does the mountain begin, where does the mountain end, you can't find any boundaries. You can't find a set of criteria to tell you what is the mountain actually and what isn't the mountain. Because the mountain is an interdependent set of causes and conditions. You are an interdependent set of causes and conditions. That doesn't mean you don't exist. You are illusion-like or dream-like in the sense that you appear to exist utterly independent of causes and conditions, but when you investigate, they're not like that. So it's similar to an illusion in that when you look into an illusion, you don't find what appeared to be there, you find something else. When you look at stage magic, it seems like there are gaps in the causal process, doesn't it? Where something happened and there's no cause for how it could have happened. Something that violates the laws of causality has happened. That's how illusions work. It's an appearance that doesn't match how it actually is. In reality, the magician has paid someone to help or is doing something with sleight of hand or whatever, and this is the causal sequence that produces the appearance of something violating normal causal sequences. Like an illusion, reality, when you look at this giant mountain, seems to exist independent of causes and conditions, including you as part of the equation, looking at the mountain. It seems to exist utterly independent of that, but as soon as I ask you, where does the mountain end? You're going to have a huge, huge, huge problem on your hands. You can't answer this question. You have no idea where the mountain begins and ends. And yet you say that there are mountains. Similar to an illusion, When you look at it, it seems to simply be there violating the laws of causality, right? How could there be this mountain that actually doesn't seem to depend on all this stuff that mountains depend upon? That's really weird. When you look more closely, you find out that the mountain is an intricate set of causes and conditions that also involves the beings who are observing mountains. So, no, it's not an illusion. It's not a dream. It's not a hallucination. Things are like an illusion, like a dream, like a hallucination in a very specific and limited sense. Let's carry on.
You tend the sick or build a home for the homeless, and you woke up and realized you had simply dreamed about doing all those things, we would say maybe you might, because of the dream, be inspired to go out and perform such deeds, but you never could say you had actually done them. Yet in Buddhism, the whole of life is nothing more than an insubstantial dream of aggregate causes and effects which arise and cease.
That's not just in Buddhism. Show me a person that isn't an aggregate of parts and causes. Show me one, and then we'll talk about life not being made of aggregate causes. Show me the person working in the soup kitchen whose body and mind do not depend upon parts and causes. Show me that person, and I will very happily admit that, okay, you're right. Actually, it's all people that exist independent of causes and conditions doing all this stuff. But you can't do that. You can't show me a person that doesn't exist based upon causes and conditions, because we all exist based on causes and conditions. This is a fundamental Christian tenet. We are creatures. We are created beings. By nature, created beings are changing things. So I don't understand how and why you would be making this argument. Simply because things are depending upon causes and conditions and parts doesn't mean that they're illusions. The illusion is when you look at it, you think there's something more to it than that. You think there's something more to the mountain than the parts and causes and changing conditions and the mind of the one who is looking at the mountain. You think there's something more than that, making it a mountain. And there's not. There's just all of the parts making it up, like the reflection in the mirror requires all of the parts that make up the perception of something appearing in a mirror. Without all of those parts, it goes away. Let's continue.
The doctrine of ethics in Christianity is rooted in the creation of the world. The whole of humanity is created in God's image. Therefore, we love and we have compassion out of not just the conditions people find themselves in, but they're actually objects of God's love, and they're created in the image of God. Christ did not come to transcend or extinguish humanity. He came to ignite it, make it more.
The basis of Buddhist ethics is that there really are sentient beings who really do have causal continuums of mental stuff that have been going on since beginningless time, who really are going up and down according to their karma. So your compassion is on the basis of a sentient being who exists as a dependent arising. Beings are created by causal processes, according to Buddhism, and it is those beings you're having compassion for. Except that Buddhists don't limit themselves simply to human beings who are supposedly created in the image of a deity. We also include all sentient beings, including beings who have already entered heavens, have entered hells, including deities. None of these things depend upon the particular circumstances of a being, I think, in the way that he means. It's based upon the larger picture of all beings carrying on with the three types of sufferings, beginninglessly, infinitely up until this very time. So all sentient beings who want happiness haven't had it for beginningless suffering rebirths. And all beings who want to be free from suffering haven't been free for beginningless suffering rebirths. And we don't limit ourselves to humans. All beings, all conscious beings. That to me seems like a very stable basis for generating loving kindness and compassion. And as I've said in previous videos, that love and compassion from our side has been put to the test in extreme circumstances in the modern era. People like Palden Gyatso, who spent 20 years in Chinese labor camps, or Garchen Rinpoche, who spent 20 years in Chinese labor camps, still have tremendous loving kindness and compassion for the Chinese, including the people that were torturing them. So this is not some hypothetical, unstable compassion. This is an extremely powerful compassion. Furthermore, if you look at neurological tests, Mingyur Rinpoche, who has spent 6 years in various types of retreat, had his brain scan done, and his compassion, when he generated compassion, was so profound, according to neurologists, it didn't fit on the normal bell curve for human empathy. It was so far outside the range of normal, it didn't even fit on the normal charts and graphs for human empathy. It was divine. It was beyond human, in one sense. It was the fulfillment of human potential in terms of loving kindness and compassion. So no, I don't accept this at all. Let's carry on.
Christ did not come to transcend or extinguish humanity. He came to ignite it, make it more fully alive than ever before. So Buddhist compassion is always at the level of pity, because the focus is on not on human sufferers, but just the pity about the chain of causality which we've been caught in, which is known as the wheel of samsara. But the Christian compassion can soar to the heights of sacrificial love, because a genuine relationship is possible between real people who are bound by their common dignity as those created in the image of God.
Again, I have to jump in. Pity is a mental state, according to Buddhist psychology, that looks down on another person for suffering. That you are high up because you're not suffering or you're in a good condition, and you're looking down on that person going, oh, look at you. You don't have what I have. Wow. And that is not at all what Buddhist compassion is about. Not at all what Buddhist compassion is about. In fact, one of the exercises that is used in Buddhist psychology to develop compassion is one of self-sacrificial love. I'll give you a very brief induction into that way of thinking. You are one person who has an innate desire for freedom, an innate desire for happiness. Yes, you want to be free from suffering, you want to have happiness, but you're one person. Imagine you put like one loaf of bread over here on the left-hand side, right? All sentient beings, countless billions, trillions, 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 trillions of sentient beings, a mountain of loaves of bread, have exactly the same desire as you do. Identical. No difference. How in the world could you remain focused on just your own interests when you have exactly the same desire as all these other beings, but your desire is equivalent to this one little loaf of bread, and their desire and their need is equivalent to this limitless mountain of bread on the other side? Their hunger for happiness and freedom from suffering is absolutely astronomical compared to your hunger for happiness and freedom from suffering. Yeah. So how could you stay simply focused on your own happiness, freedom from suffering? Right? How could you do that? How? Logically, you have nowhere to hide from this. This doesn't mean that you have to stop doing all the conventional stuff you need to do to take care of yourself. But it means that any time there's an opportunity to help others to actually make progress in accomplishing genuine happiness and freedom from suffering, you have to take it. You have to do something, right? In any case, there are hundreds of lines of reasoning like this that you find in Buddhist texts that are right along these lines of self-sacrificial attitudes, and you develop these on purpose. So again, I just don't accept the line of reasoning and the way of framing the issues that's being presented here.
To the Buddhists, there can be no eternal relationships because we are nothing more than the temporary aggregate of various components.
Sorry, I thought I'd be able to let it go, but that's not true either. The Buddha, for example, had the same wife, according to the Mahayana sources, was reborn as husband and wife again and again and again for something like 1 million lifetimes over and over before he attained enlightenment. And his key disciples and his children, his father, his mother, all sort of orbited together on the path of their rebirth for millions of lifetimes before Buddha attained enlightenment. So you can have relationships that are extremely long-lasting, even in the context of samsaric rebirth. Point number 2 is, if you're a great bodhisattva or a Buddha, you can have infinite relationships with other beings because you no longer forget what occurs between rebirths, because you know where other beings are in this great ocean of rebirth potentials, and you can continue to cultivate your relationships with those beings over and over and over and over and over again until they reach enlightenment. So no, you as a temporary being who's completely out of control can't stay in relationship with others. That's true. But if you train to become a great bodhisattva, to become a Buddha, then you can begin to have relationships that will last forever with other beings. And when those beings develop sufficiently, you'll be able to carry on those relationships forever, infinitely into the future. So again, I don't accept the way that this is being framed.
For the Christian, love reflects a genuine relationship, and it carries an absolute, not temporary or relative value, because God is love, 1 John 4:16. All ethical acts of charity or compassion ultimately reflect God's own nature. Love is never discarded like a raft because it is essential to God's eternal being.
Yes, likewise, part of your essential nature and part of the essential nature of a Buddha is loving kindness and compassion. Those are not discarded like a raft when you attain the goal of Buddhahood. A Buddha is by nature loving compassion because the fundamental nature of your mind is good and already is how things are. It already is truth. Out of that truth, the only rational action in relation to that truth is loving kindness and compassion. Why? Because we are interdependent. We are relationship, to put it in Christian language. We already are relationship. So the only thing that makes sense is not just looking out for myself, it's looking out for all beings who are involved in this massive relationship that I have with others. So you don't discard love, you don't discard compassion. Those are things that you develop to perfection in the attainment of Buddhahood, and then you carry on with those as a Buddha, helping all beings forever until all beings are freed and liberated. Ethics, patience, perseverance, training in concentration, training in wisdom, and half a dozen other things, those are what you are fundamentally. There's just a bunch of junk in the way. And the aspects of those that aren't what you are fundamentally are in alignment with these ways of behaving. And so once you've attained the actual goal of Buddhism, you don't need the method anymore that got you there to be within the attainment. You are loving and compassionate. There's no reason to train in loving, compassionate stuff anymore. That's just how you are. You don't need to train in ethics anymore because you're ethical. You don't need to train in perseverance anymore because you persevere. You don't need to train your willpower because you have willpower. You don't need to train in concentration because you have concentration. You don't have to train in all the methods of wisdom because you already directly know wisdom. The attainment of Buddhahood is the attainment of the perfection of these things. Okay, let's carry on.
Scripture can say, if anyone says, I love God, yet hates his brother, he's a liar. For anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And he has given us this command, whoever loves God must also love his brother. That's a profoundly Christian statement. Christian ethics, therefore, finds its source and entire orientation in God and has been most profoundly demonstrated by the incarnation of Jesus Christ. It's through the incarnation that the concrete nature of Christian ethics has been affirmed in the final sense. The bodhisattva, who has compassion and does descend into the world to alleviate suffering, in the case of Tibetan Buddhism, literally in the Dalai Lama, but in Buddhism, and most Buddhism, they're in the wheel of samsara, helping you from there, has been compared often to the incarnation who comes and redeems the human race from sin and suffering. But they're comparable only at a most superficial level. And I want to mention two possible distinctions that are important. The compassionate bodhisattva is part of the causal nexus with no substantial reality. The bodhisattva does descend, but he does not descend in the way Christ descends into the world as the one and true actual God who steps into the pages of real human history.
With respect to descending into the world, the Buddha descended from one of the heavens, which I'll put on the screen, before he entered the world. So the Buddha was living, in essence, like a god, and was waiting for the perfect time, the perfect family, the perfect circumstances, and descended into the world to be the Buddha. So his last rebirth, that was still at least partially under the influence of karma, was his rebirth as Siddhartha Gautama. Some traditions say that his rebirth as Siddhartha Gautama was just an appearance. It was an emanation, that he had already been a Buddha for a long time and just emanated or appeared for us in that way to benefit us. But none of this is illusory. None of this is a dream. All of it is real. Dependent origination is real. That's what makes things real, not unreal. The Buddha specifically rejects the view of non-existence. And the Buddha specifically rejects the view of utterly independent existence. The Buddha puts forward the view of interdependent existence. So, of course, if a bodhisattva descends, he descends through processes that are interdependently existent, because that's the only option. The state of a bodhisattva's mind, if they've already attained nirvana, for example, is a permanent attainment. And there are other levels of permanent attainment before the attainment of nirvana, whether abiding or non-abiding. And there are permanent attainments beyond nirvana, like the attainment of a Buddha. So once again, I'm a bit at a loss for why he would be presenting it in this way. Either he just doesn't know, or he's deliberately trying to make the audience think that the case is quite a bit different than it is. Let's carry on.
The Bodhisattvas within Buddhism, they act because they believe that no one can actually finally enter nirvana until all enter into nirvana.
That's not true. You can enter nirvana. You can enter nirvana before the end of the current universe. There's a bunch of people who have already entered nirvana. You don't have to enter nirvana together. One of the ways you train yourself in motivation as a bodhisattva is the feeling that if you could, you would bring everyone together. One big boat into nirvana. But in reality, you can't. You have to attain your realizations. You have to get out of the quicksand, make a rope, and then use the rope to help other people get out of the quicksand. So just no.
This means that the bodhisattva's acts of compassion are really part and parcel of their own movement towards salvation and purgation of the notion of self. The bodhisattva who acts compassionately and then the recipient of the act are actually one and the same. They often say samsara, that is, or suffering, dukkha, is nirvana. There's no difference between that two ultimately. Which brings my second.
Oh my goodness gracious. There's a difference between the nature of two things being the same and the qualitative experience of two things being the same. The fundamental nature of how nirvana exists and the fundamental nature of how samsara exists are the same. What is that nature? Dependent arisings. Surprise! Samsara and nirvana have the same fundamental quality in terms of their existence. If we're talking about how do they exist, how do we explain how they exist? It's like saying this cup is made of particles. So is my table, so is my microphone, so is the computer. These are all made of particles. But the cup is not the computer, and the computer is not the microphone, and the microphone is not the table. Those are all different things. So yes, they exist with the same fundamental nature, which is that they are dependent arisings, but they don't exist as exactly the same thing. Samsara and nirvana are not the same thing.
Point in that Buddhist ethics, good and evil are ultimately denied, and therefore true ethics makes no sense if you have no conception of good and evil. In the Buddhist worldview, as with most of Hinduism, they reject a dualistic conception of the world in favor of a monistic or non-dualistic one. Now, dualistic distinctions are present for them only in provisional ways, only in functional ways. True enlightenment will always involve the jettison of such dualistic distinctions. Therefore, all the distinctions that we know about, such as saved and lost, heaven and hell, good, evil, even God or Satan, all of these are psychological props which must be dissolved by true knowledge. Now, the implications this has for ethics is enormous. How can compassion and loving kindness and charity, three of the key virtues of...
This is also not true. To say that something is conventionally existent in Buddhism is to say that it's a dependent arising. Good and bad exist as dependent arisings. They don't exist independent of dependent arising. Dualities exist as dependent arisings. They don't exist independent of dependent arising. Ethics exists as a dependent arising. It doesn't exist independent of dependent arising. I feel like I'm a broken record. I'm probably going to have to cut a lot of this. All of these things exist. They're not jettisoned at any point. There's an example from the Buddhist canon where a murderer gets aboard a boat and is planning to kill 500 people on the boat. The Buddha, as a bodhisattva, knows that this is about to occur and sees that the only way to stop this is to kill this person. So out of compassion, not wanting this murderer to suffer in hell for countless eons from killing 500 people, and to save 500 people who would have been killed, the Buddha decides he is going to kill this person. Now, according to our tradition, that action still resulted in the Buddha being reborn in an unfortunate rebirth for a short period of time. But because the vast majority of what was going on in terms of that ethical action, in terms of that action, was something virtuous, saving lives, the Buddha, the main force of this action, propelled him further down the path of training towards the perfection of his character. So, yes, the action of killing the person who was the thief was still negative by nature, according to Buddhism, according to karmic theory. But at the same time, you do have a moral responsibility in some cases to do things that aren't ethical in order to accomplish a greater good. Let's carry on.
Buddhism, karuna, maitri, and dana, be recognized or measured when ultimately there's no distinction between good and evil. Once the enlightened bodhisattva has realized that samsara is nirvana, then how can any subsequent act be declared compassionate? To speak of it...
Well, because samsara and nirvana have the same dependent arising nature, but they aren't the same thing. Good and bad have the same dependent arising nature, but they aren't the same thing. Virtuous karmic actions and negative karmic actions have the same dependent arising nature, but they aren't the same thing. One of them results in suffering. The other results in either moving further down the path or some kind of pleasurable experience for you in the future. They're not the same thing.
An act as compassionate necessarily involves contrasting points of reference to be intelligible. To declare that any given deed is an act of compassion assumes that there is a virtue which is beneficial. It also assumes possible negative scenarios if you don't help the woman caught in human trafficking, if you don't start the orphanage to help the child without parents. All those things are real acts in the Christian world that make a real difference in the world.
And those are real acts in the Buddhist world and make a real difference in the world.
Ultimately, the incarnation gives honor to. Life in Buddhism cannot be accorded to any better test than death, because everything is dependent and would not arise if not for the other. Pratitya Samuppada, or the causal nexus, is the great leveler of all of Buddhism. Now, Christian ethics, because we embrace the real categories of good and evil, and this, by the way, comes out of the whole revelation of God's Word. You have in the Pentateuch, the choice of life and death. In the Psalms, the choice of the righteous and the wicked. In the Proverbs, the wise and the foolish. Eventually, in the New Testament, to be lost or be saved. All of that arises out of a profound understanding of the very nature of reality and how we embody the world that we live in. For the New Testament, mystery is that which is being revealed. We don't live in a world where we actually find ourselves trumping out previous things we learned. Actually, if you teach your children even simple truths about Christianity, about how we understand reality, whatever you say, however simply you say it to your children, it should be true. And so as we get older, we become more nuanced perhaps, we understand things more profoundly, but ultimately the greatest thing we learn shouldn't trump out the earlier levels of things we learn.
This goes back to the Lotus Sutra and the three children. It's a ladder of teachings. The earlier things don't trump out the later things, and the later things don't trump out the earlier things. It's a ladder of understanding. You teach someone who doesn't have the capacity at this time to understand or be inclined towards Mahayana practice, again, operating under this theory in the Lotus Sutra, you teach them, get liberated for yourself. You don't want to be unhappy, right? Get liberated for yourself. Okay? Go do that. They work on this and they develop concentration, they develop some loving kindness, they develop some compassion, because those help you attain nirvana too. And somewhere along the way, they've developed and they're a very different person now. And you say, you know what? What if you went for full enlightenment instead? Don't you care about all of the sentient beings that you have compassion for and loving kindness for? Why don't you carry on past nirvana now and go to full enlightenment? You haven't been lied to or something. Those goals do exist. You can do those things, but there's further goals. And once you develop to a certain level of capability, then Buddhas, according to some traditions, will continue to push you to go all the way to the end. Because if you do that, more beings will benefit. More beings will be helped than if you just remained in nirvana for yourself.
Karl Barth was, of course, famously asked, and I'm sure you know the story, at the end of a very erudite lecture, was once asked what was the greatest and highest truth he'd ever learned as one of the great theologians of the 20th century. And he said, "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so." The point being that the first thing you learn as a Christian is never trumped by the last thing you learn, because it's all connected to a real conception of the world. Now, this lecture has highlighted several key differences between Christian and Buddhist ethics. From the Christian point of view, the denial of both self and of the ethical deeds.
If you're working with someone who has an addiction, for example, the later advice you're going to give them does trump this earlier advice. The earlier advice is, hey, while you're in this fragile state of addiction, you need to stay away from your friends who drink. You need to stay away from bars. Don't challenge yourself with all of this stuff. Just start working on yourself. Try to stay sober. Take it a day at a time. These sorts of things. Later, when this person has been sober for a much longer period of time and their life is much more stable in theory, then maybe you say, okay, when you go to the holiday party with your friends and people are drinking, just do such and such and such. The advice changes because you've changed as a person. So the earlier teachings in Buddhism are working with you while you're still under the massive influence of all of your negative emotions in a way that you're not going to be when you're further down the path. So the advice that you get earlier on in the process is going to be different than the advice you're going to get later on. This is a completely natural part of working with yourself in terms of training your mind in anything. Let's carry on.
Places the whole framework of Buddhist ethics in jeopardy. Because ethics, from a Christian perspective, involves a real relationship between the one acting and the one receiving the act. And secondly, it requires the ultimate differentiation between good and evil. And Buddhism denies both of these. The Buddhist ethical system is like an onion, where after peeling out all the layers, has no substantive core, by their own admission. The result is ethics only can function to temporary...
I don't admit it. I don't admit that. No, not at all. That's not true. Your good actions lead to good results. Your bad actions lead to bad results. They don't exist the way they appear, but they do exist. And the way they exist is like that. Do I need to say more? I don't think I need to say more than this. The person doing the actions exists dependently. The person who's having the actions performed on them exists dependently. So this is how you exist. This is how people exist. This is how ethics exists. This is how good and bad exists. To say there's no substantive core is actually missing a really, really fundamental point that we're making here, which is that you have a cognitive error where you see these things existing in a way they don't exist. And that's provable. It's not just a belief. You can look at the mountain and go, yeah, it's just out there. It has nothing to do with me. And then as soon as you start analyzing the mountain, you can't find the mountain existing the way that it appears. You look in the mirror, you see the reflection, and you go, yeah, it looks like there's stuff on the surface of the mirror or stuff inside the mirror. As soon as you start investigating, you can't find anything inside the mirror. That is a fact. The way it actually exists, the mirror's reflection exists as a set of dependent relationships. The mountain exists as a set of dependent relationships. Ethics exists as a set of dependent relationships. People exist as a set of dependent relationships. That's how they exist. So what we're saying is non-existent is the object that is seen by our ignorance. My cup exists, but the type of object my ignorance says exists as the cup doesn't exist. My ignorance says this cup exists somehow independent of causes and conditions, somehow independent of parts, somehow independent of subject and object relationships. When I look for a cup existing like that, I can't find one. All I can find in it is a cup that exists while depending upon its parts, while depending upon causes and conditions, while depending upon relationships between subjects and objects. That's the only cup that I can actually find. So that cup is real. And if I drink out of it, it works, and I can actually drink liquid. And if I use it to harm someone, that harm is actually real, dependent upon a bunch of relationships. This is a point that people need to get right, not just the Christians, but this is something I see a lot in Buddhist forums online and so forth. You have to get this right because ethics is so absolutely critical to human well-being in this lifetime, religion aside. And according to Buddhism, is the foundation for training in meditation and the foundation for you having a good rebirth. So if you don't get ethics right, you're going to be in big trouble.
Very provisional level as a concession to human ignorance and who lack the true spiritual knowledge. In the final,
the provisional level is you need ethical guardrails described to you in some kind of commitment system that allows you to train in ethics before you do things ethically naturally. That whole mouthful is really just meant to communicate. You're going to take vows as a Buddhist, for example, to not kill, not steal, not drink, not lie, not commit sexual misconduct. You're going to take vows as a Buddhist, potentially, to do all these activities of a bodhisattva. You're going to take vows as a Buddhist, potentially, to maintain all of your tantric commitments, etc. So there are all of these methods that help you train in ethics. Once you're ethical, once you've actually accomplished being an ethical person, in particular through training in wisdom, which is at the end of the path, when all of your behavior is naturally ethical, then you don't need vows and stuff to keep you being ethical. You are ethical. And the perfection of ethics is attained along the bodhisattva path. But even once you've attained the perfection of ethics, you still take vows, because taking the vows enhances the karmic potential created through your ethical actions. And so at some point, the merit that is created through taking those vows propels you even faster, even more strongly towards enlightenment. But once you've attained enlightenment, then you don't need the vows. You just act ethically, right? So, all right.
Final analysis, true knowledge will trump all ethical actions, however noble they may be, as well as the givers and receivers of compassion, loving kindness, and giving. Now, what are our takeaways from this? Well, first, the maxim that all religions are the same, surely you must get, is utterly false.
I agree.
Even in the area of ethics, where one would expect to find the most joyful congruence. In many ways, we find this striking, dramatic differences, the unfathomable gap between Christian and Buddhist ethics, which, by the way, doesn't mean that we cannot cooperate in the public square on many, many things. But I'm just saying from a Christian perspective, we have to acknowledge that. Two, religious people are every bit as needing of the gospel as non-religious people. We have to understand this, that Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims need to hear the glorious, wonderful, good news of Jesus Christ. And thirdly, finally, we should never be caught into the narrative that's becoming increasingly popular, that Christianity is at its root a hateful, destructive force in the world. No, I want to say no. Christians by the millions, many of them DTS grads, they're all over the world. And I have, as was mentioned, I have been all over the world. I've been on every inhabited continent. I've been involved in ministries all over the world. And wherever you go to the place of poverty, I find Christians there working. You go look for where the orphans are being cared for. I find Christians there all over the world. You go to refugee camps. It's the Christians that are there. This is true all over the world. You go to the human trafficking, people working with human trafficking. I tell our graduates, one of our things I tell often to our graduates, I say, when you go to your town or your city, I say, go to the mayor and ask the mayor or the leader of your town, say, what is it that keeps you awake at night? And whatever they tell you to do, then take that on. And we had one of our graduates, for example, who was in Orlando, went to her mayor and asked him, what keeps you awake at night? And he said, if you know Orlando, you know what this means. He says OBT. Now, OBT stands for Orange Blossom Trail. It's a beautiful sounding name for a street, but it's actually one of the most dangerous streets in America. Human trafficking, drugs. People wouldn't walk down OBT in the daytime, much less at night. It has been it's the most crime-ridden streets in America. What does she do? This is Rhonda Stapleton. Rhonda Stapleton goes down and she purchases a house on OBT. And she begins to rescue people from the worst imaginable horrors. And has now had multiple homes open on OBT, all for rescuing people in the worst kind of entrapment you can imagine. This is just one person. There are millions like this all over the world in the name of Christ doing these kind of things. You do not need to feel embarrassed about the Christian witness around the world. It's profound. The Muslims say Allah is on his throne. That's their own admission. 12 times in the text, Allah cannot come off of his throne. And so that it creates a separation from the world in that theology. Christians don't have that. The Hindus say that all we have is karma. And there is no possibility of vicarious suffering. No one can bear the suffering of another. You alone reap what you alone sow. So you don't have that. That's why the whole Buddhist thing came up. They reject it because Hindus had no ethic of compassion. But in the Buddhist world, all you're caught in is this causal net of causality. So there is a powerful fact that Christians are least unleashed into the world. And
with respect, in reality, you're caught in a causal web. Our debate with the Christian faith is not whether there is a causal web, because we are creatures, according to the Christian faith. We are creations, and we are changing by nature, depending upon parts, depending upon causes and conditions. That's how it is. So the debate between Buddhists and Christians, because we're creations, is a debate between whether or not this web of changing stuff, made of parts, made of causes, comes from previous causes and conditions, or comes from a causeless, unchanging, eternal being. That's the debate. And all of the evidence of reality shows us that all caused things made of parts that are constantly changing come from other things that are made of parts and constantly changing, and so forth. So the Buddhist view is that fact just carries on past the Big Bang, and it is minds and karma and physical reality that forms this causal chain, and that's how existence exists. There's no first moment of existence. Since there's no first moment of existence, we don't need to explain how existence came into existence, because it didn't come into existence. Existence has always existed. We can't explain why existence as a whole exists in the same way that if there's a God existing, Christians can't explain why existence as God exists. So both positions have this problem of why is there something rather than nothing? Why was there not just nothing in general? So we haven't fixed the problem by introducing God, and in fact, we've introduced a whole number of other problems. Let's carry on.
So there is a powerful fact that Christians are least unleashed into the world, and you may not even realize it, but you're unleashed into the world to do acts of compassion, ethics, because of the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. The incarnation is what makes all of that possible. I want to close with a story. When I was in China, and the Chinese are wonderful hosts. I would just say they're a wonderful host, and I was there for a semester teaching, and they were determined to take me to all the places, the famous places, the Three River Gorges and the Tiananmen Square and the Great Wall of China and all of that. And so we were in this very large Buddhist temple in Beijing, one of the largest, most dramatic, gorgeous Buddhist temples in the world. And we come down this main aisle, and this young lady who is our translator was with us. And on the front of the platform was this massive Buddha. It was a Bodhisattva Buddha that had a huge stomach. I'm sure you've seen this Buddha. Now in India, where I worked, the Buddha is very emaciated.
So that's not a Buddha. That's a representation of a particular Bodhisattva who was known for eating a lot of food, wandering through the city, this sort of thing. Let's carry on.
You can actually count his ribs because he's in this denial stage. By the time you get to Japan, the Buddha's taking on a lot of weight. So it was a very, very big Buddha with the long ears and everything. And so we're looking at this Buddha, and she says to me, she said, "Do you know why the Buddha has such a big stomach?" And I said, "No, tell me." And she said, "Well, when I came into this temple as a little girl, I could not believe the size of the Buddha's stomach. And so I said to my mother, why does the Buddha have such a big stomach?" And she said to me, this whole conversation is happening right there in the presence of this Buddha. She said, my mother said to me, the reason the Buddha's stomach is so big is so he can contain all of our sins. So I'm listening to that. I didn't say a word. I was just kind of absorbing this information when she said this to me. "But I've never believed that a statue could hold my sins." Now, I'm many things, but in my root, I'm a preacher of the gospel. And I realized this might be
So there is this idea that bodhisattvas will take on suffering for the sake of others. And in fact, beings who are striving for enlightenment take on unbelievable hardships to try to generate the internal states that will give them the ability to benefit others. If you watch the commentary I put up recently on yogis of Tibet, the incredible burden that these practitioners place on themselves to access these states that will allow them to benefit others. I mean, it's just astonishing, the work that they put in. There's also this idea of exchanging self for others in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, where you do exercises where you imagine that you're taking all of the pain, all the difficulty, all the suffering of all other beings, regardless of who they are, including the enemies and the friends and the strangers. It doesn't matter. You're taking all of this upon yourself. You're taking all their suffering and difficulty into yourself and upon yourself. And you're giving them all of your happiness and your potential for happiness. Great masters of giving and taking practice, they say, like Venerable Atisha, for example, in some cases, because of their special relationship with particular beings, actually do take the suffering of another being upon themselves, not in a metaphorical or allegorical or imaginative sense, but they gain the ability to actually take the suffering of another person onto themselves. Sometimes that's graphically represented as a bodhisattva who is overweight, who has eaten or taken in the suffering of all beings. And they're smiling and overjoyed because through this, they're able to benefit all beings. Taking in the suffering of others and giving away your happiness causes more happiness. This is the tremendous irony. So this bodhisattva is sitting there smiling, having taken in all the suffering, right? It's incredibly profound message and symbolism, actually. And in terms of the statues, it's not actually the statue itself that you're bowing to. It's the mind of a Buddha or a bodhisattva who's not simply bound by ordinary time and space. Their mind is stretched out and abiding over a large area. In the case of a Buddha's mind abides everywhere. It's omnipresent. So the Buddha's mind is present at the location of the statue, and some bodhisattvas' minds are present at the location of the statue, according to Buddhist understandings of consciousness. So you're not bowing to the physical stuff making up the statue. You're bowing to the being who is being represented by the statue, and you're bowing to the principles that the statue represents, like taking all suffering into yourself and achieving happiness because of having done so, which should sound familiar, Christians. So, wrapping up, I think the biggest takeaway from today is that dependent origination doesn't mean things don't exist. Dependent origination is how Buddhists establish infinite causal chains of rebirth, infinite universes behind this one. This is how we establish ethics. This is how we establish the difference between samsara and nirvana. This is how we begin to explain what it is that has gone wrong with the cognitive processes of human beings that something like the Eightfold Path can fix, or something like the Bodhisattva path can fix, or something like the Tantric path can fix, or some combination of these three things can begin fixing. I think what outsiders find challenging is that Buddhism uses very powerful language to try to uproot, to try to damage and destroy the wrong ways in which we see the world. And it's only in light of understanding the genre that one goes, yes, I see what they're doing with the language here. That's really interesting. That's really powerful. When you read certain genres of Buddhist literature, like the Perfection of Wisdom or certain aspects of the Pali Canon, it does sound like they're saying, well, for example, there's no self. But then you read a few lines down and it says, but also, there's a self. Oh, wait a minute. Is there a self or is there no self? Well, we need to define our terms. What do we mean by self? What do we mean by not self? What do we mean by existent? What do we mean by non-existent? What do we mean by samsara? What do we mean by nirvana? What do we mean by good? What do we mean by bad? And on and on and on and on. What do you mean by duality? A lot of different ways to define duality. What do you mean by ultimately existent? What do you mean by conventionally existent? What do you mean by substantially existent versus insubstantial? What do you mean by permanent versus impermanent? All of these things are technical subjects, and you can't simply hop on board with no training, no background, no significant understanding of the subjects, read the literature, and come away with the correct understanding. So, with that, my recommendation is find a good lineage, find good teachers, study deeply, train deeply, make some progress, and as usual, hope to see you again soon. Cheers.